Hello Orchid friends, how are you? Welcome back to my channel. If this is your first time watching my video, my channel is all about orchids. From what orchids I have, how I grow them, my thoughts on certain orchid topics, to what orchids in my collection are blooming, etc. So if you want to follow along my orchid hobby adventure, please consider subscribing to my channel and turn on the notification. Today in this video, we're going to look at another Phalaenopsis species, and this one is called Phal equestris. And also, in this video, I'm going to answer some of the questions I received for the kind of method, the no drainage hole moss method that I used, and it's the kind of method I use for this orchid. So I'll use this opportunity to answer some of the questions regarding this growing method, as well as share my thoughts on what kind of situation this particular method is good for, and what kind of situations may not necessarily work, and what are some of the things that you should look out for. For this particular orchid type, I actually have two orchids in my collection. This one is the younger one of the two, because this one is only blooming for the very first time this year, and the other one, when I first got it, when I received it, it already had a dried flower spike. So I knew that orchid was already older than this particular one. Now, so mid-April 2019 was the time that I first saw the spike emerging, and then pretty soon it started to elongate at a relatively fast speed. Within about a month or so, the spike pretty much reached its full length and started to focus on its energy on the buds. So the buds were plumping up pretty quickly. And as you can see, this orchid is in a small cup. I think this cup is only 12 ounce, and at the time I decided to use the 12 ounce cup and use this method was because this orchid, even though with all the leaves, healthy leaves, but it didn't have really good root system, and I wanted to find a way that would allow this orchid to get enough water without me having to water it all the time, but then also make sure that I don't use too big of a container, because for a small orchid in a bigger container, it's very easy for you to overwater and further cause root rot issues. So I decided to use this no drainage hole method with moss. And that method also happened to be the method that I really wanted to try out for different orchids, just to see how this method works in my growing environment. Now, you can see here, so it took about a month and a half between mid-April to early June 2019 to, go from young spike to its first bloom. It's not too bad. Consider, if you compare this to Oncidium type orchids, you may have spikes in late summer, and then you will wait until end of the year, in the middle of winter for your Oncidium twinkles, for example, to start blooming. So that waiting period is way longer. So this, a month and a half, that's actually not too bad. The care that I usually give to this orchid in terms of watering, because it's in a small cup, and also because the moss amount is really small, so instead of the quarter cup amount of water that I give to most of my orchids in this particular growing method, this orchid only receives 1/8 of a cup of water each time. And fertilizer, I use only 25% strength, so quarter strength fertilizer on this orchid. And overall, 1/8 of a cup, and the amount of moss that I have given to this orchid, this combo actually works really well, because the wet-dry cycle usually completes within about a week or so, usually 6 days, and by the 7th day, that's when I need to water most of my orchids, so it works out really well. And this kind of method still requires a flush. But when I say flush, I really don't take it under a faucet to let the water run through, because this, well, number one, it's you know, too much water consumption than I like, but also this cup doesn't have any drainage hole. So when I say flush for this kind of orchid and for most of my other orchids, it really just means soaking with just water and no fertilizer. At least once a month you need to do that. And after soaking, what you need to do, and this is one of the questions I get all the time regarding this kind of method, is how do you water? Other than, you know, you experiment to know exactly how much water you should give so that you don't have to dump out the water. If you do need to dump out excess, especially if you're soaking this orchid and you're done soaking it, you want to dump out the water. What I usually do is I just carefully make sure that I use my hand to somehow secure the orchid in case it's not already anchored or attached to the side of the cup. And then I would tilt it until the water will start to drip and to leak out, right? And then I will wait until there is no more dripping. There's no water drips anymore. There's no water dripping out, and that's when I know that the moss is completely saturated, but then it's not oversaturated. And that's when I put it back. And usually, you know, I don't have to worry about it for another week. So that's how I guess, drain this orchid. And then another question that I get really often is this particular growing method good for all orchid type, or any specific situation that it works really well and certain situation doesn't really work in my environment based on my experience? Yes. So it doesn't work when your orchid is already having poor root system. It would only work if you are more experienced and know how much water and how much moss a stressed orchid needs. And that could be different for different orchid type and also for different growing environment. I have tried to help some of my friends' stressed orchid to come back to life, come back on track in terms of, you know, like recovery, to get healthy again. And we noticed that even with 1/8 cup of water, because there isn't enough root system to intake the 1/8 cup of water, and if so, you know, it could still be too saturated for too long that, you know, existing older roots you know, would not make it, would rot. But then if you give only very little amount of moss, then you're risking of having to water all the time, and sometimes, you know, if you don't remember, it gets too dry for too long, then a stressed orchid is already stressed. So you know, I think that kind of situation is just much more difficult to use this kind of method. And for all my healthy orchid grown in this method, even if they don't have established or abundant of roots to begin with, they usually adopt this method and grow roots pretty fast. So it doesn't really work for already stressed orchid, but then for Phalaenopsis, this method actually works particularly well. I think this method is fun, but you do have to make sure when you pack the moss, it has to be very lightly packed so that you can make sure there is enough air and enough room for water to evaporate. Because you're going to need that, because there is no other way for air to get in or out or for water to evaporate. Unlike cups or containers with a drainage hole at the bottom. Now, for already stressed orchid, my experience is that if you do things correctly, water culture would be a better way, easier way to revive a already stressed orchid for root production. And that's assumed that you're also using, for example, liquid seaweed, some type of hormone to help root production. But this method is still pretty fun. It just requires an understanding of how to control the water amount provided, but also the amount of moss and how it's packed, how you put the moss around the roots within the container. And the key word really is to make it fluffy.
以上就是今天为您带来的影片。如果你喜欢这个影片，请帮我在影片的下面点个赞。如果你要继续与我一起学习怎么养兰，别忘记订阅我的频道并打开通知铃铛。谢谢您的观赏，我们下次再见。